Welcome to the channel where legends sleep. Tonight's story takes us to the ancient greenwood of medieval England, where the great oaks of Sherwood Forest hold secrets older than the kingdom itself. This is a tale that English folklore has carried for centuries, passed like embers from village to village, whispered by those who dared hope that justice might wear a hooded cloak. There is an outlaw here, one whose name the poor would breathe like a prayer and the powerful would curse in candlelit halls. He moves between the shadows and the sunlight, swift as an arrow loosed from a longbow, and the forest itself seems to conspire in his favor. What drives a man to become legend? What hunger? What wound? What quiet fury reshapes an ordinary soul into something the world cannot forget? Tonight, the mist settles low over Nottinghamshire, and someone is waiting in the trees. So lie back, breathe slowly, and let the ancient world take over. There is a forest in the heart of England that is older than memory, older than the names men gave to rivers and hills, older, some say, than the very stories told about it. It is called Sherwood, and on certain mornings when the mist moves low between the oaks and the light comes through the canopy in long, soft columns, it is easy to believe that the forest is breathing, that it is alive in some slow, patient way that has nothing to do with the hurry of human lives. The oaks of Sherwood are enormous things. Their bark is deeply grooved, like the faces of old men who have seen too much and chosen wisely to say very little. Their roots grip the earth the way a sleeping hand grips a blanket, with a kind of unconscious certainty, as though letting go has simply never occurred to them. Beneath their canopy, the light is always amber green, always shifting, always gentle. Even at noon, when the sun is high and fierce above the treetops, the forest floor rests in a soft and living shade. Moss covers everything it can reach. Ferns unfurl in the hollows. And somewhere, always, there is the sound of water moving over smooth stone. It was into this forest that a young man named Robin of Loxley came, one gray autumn evening, with nothing but the clothes on his back, a long bow in his hand, and a heart full of something that had not yet decided whether it would become grief or fury. He had been, until very recently, a nobleman, the son of a lord. His family held lands to the north of Nottingham, good land, green and rolling, with a stone manor house that smelled of wood smoke and old timber. Robin had grown up on those lands, had learned to ride and to hunt across them, had known every farmer and miller and shepherd by name. He was not a soft young man, despite his noble birth. He could draw a long bow with a steadiness that made older archers go quiet and watchful. He could track a deer through wet leaves without a sound, but he was also known, in the villages near Loxley, for the warmth of his greeting and the readiness of his laugh. He was the kind of young man that people remembered after he had gone. And so when the Sheriff of Nottingham came for the Loxley estate, there were many who wept. The sheriff's name was a weight that people carried carefully in those days, setting it down only when they had to, and never for long. He governed the shire in the name of the king, King Richard, who was far away on crusade, fighting holy wars in distant deserts, while his kingdom quietly suffered beneath the heel of men like the sheriff. In Richard's absence, the sheriff had grown comfortable. He had grown certain. He raised the taxes on the villages until the granaries ran low, and children went to bed with their ribs showing through their skin. He fined men for walking in the king's forest, for fishing in the king's rivers, for cutting wood to warm their families through the cold months. The law in the sheriff's hands had become a tool for one thing only: the steady accumulation of power. The charge brought against Robin's father was false. Most of the people in the shire knew it, but the sheriff's word was the law, and the law had no interest in being fair. The estate was seized. The old lord was imprisoned in Nottingham's castle, beneath stone walls that heard no appeals. And Robin, returning home from a journey to find the gates of his own manor barred against him and the sheriff's men standing in his courtyard, was given a simple choice: submit and join his father in the castle's dark, or run. He ran. He did not run blindly. He was a hunter's son, trained to think clearly even when his heart was loud. He took what he could carry: his longbow, a quiver of arrows, a small knife, and a loaf of bread from a farmer's wife who pressed it into his hands without a word, her eyes bright with something between sorrow and defiance. Then he turned his face toward Sherwood and walked until the trees closed around him and the lights of the manor vanished behind the dark. For the first nights, the forest was simply cold. He built small fires and lay close to them, listening to the sounds of the wood settling around him, the distant call of an owl, the soft creak of branches in the wind, the occasional startled movement of some creature in the undergrowth. He ate what he could find and what he could catch, which was not, at first, very much. His noble hands blistered. His boots, fine ones, made for riding rather than walking, rubbed his heels raw. He was hungry more often than he was not, but the forest was teaching him something, slowly and without any particular gentleness. It was teaching him that survival was not given. It was built one careful choice at a time: where to shelter, where to find dry wood, which streams ran clean and which ran cloudy from the clay, how to move quietly enough that the deer did not catch his scent, how to wait, and as the days passed and the blisters healed into calluses, and the hunger sharpened his senses rather than dulling them, something else was growing in Robin of Loxley. Not merely anger, though that was there. Not merely grief, though that was there too, like an ember banked low beneath the ash. It was something slower and more purposeful, a kind of clarity. He had lost everything that wealth and title could give a man, and he had found in that loss that he was still himself, still the man who knew the farmers by name, still the man whose laugh came easily, still the man who could not watch a child go hungry without his hands wanting to do something about it. The forest held him, and quietly, without ceremony, Sherwood began to feel less like a place of exile and more like something else entirely, something that might, in time, come to feel like home. And so it was that the weeks began to pass, one folding quietly into the next, like pages turning in a book no one had yet finished writing. Robin had made his camp deep in the greenwood, where 3 old oaks grew so close together their roots had long since tangled into something like an embrace. He had a fire, a bedroll of bracken and wool, and enough dried meat and foraged mushroom to keep a man thinking clearly. What he did not yet have was company. And loneliness, he discovered, has a particular weight when the world you have lost was full of people you loved. That was about to change. The first companion arrived without fanfare, as the best ones often do. Robin had been walking the old deer path that followed the river south, moving quietly through the dappled morning light, when he came to a narrow log bridge. Just a great fallen oak laid across the water, barely wide enough for one man to cross with his arms out for balance. And there, already halfway across it from the other side, was the largest human being Robin had ever seen. The man was enormous. That is the only word that fits. He stood perhaps a full head taller than Robin, with shoulders like the lintel of a barn door, and hands that could have palmed a cartwheel. He carried a long wooden staff, and he moved across the log with a kind of careful, lumbering dignity, the way a bear might if you taught it to be patient. They met in the middle. For a moment, neither spoke. The river moved below them, gray and cool and unbothered. "One of us," said the big man pleasantly, "is going to have to step aside." "I was here first," said Robin, which was not quite true, but felt like the sort of thing worth testing. The big man looked at him with mild brown eyes. "That bridge is not wide enough for argument." "Then let's settle it properly," Robin said, and he stepped back to the bank, cut himself a long staff from a nearby ash tree, stripped it quick and clean, and returned to the log. "The one who ends up in the river steps aside." The big man smiled slowly. It was a smile that suggested he had won this sort of contest before. What followed was 10 minutes of the finest staff work Robin had ever been a party to, and he had trained with some of the sharpest men in Nottinghamshire. The log swayed. The river waited. Back and forth they went, Robin quick and clever, reading the angles, feinting left and pressing right, and the big man steady and immovable as a millstone, absorbing every strike and returning it twice as sure. In the end, it was Robin who went into the water. He went in with a magnificent splash and came up sputtering, his hair plastered flat across his face, and found the big man standing on the bank above him, hand extended. "John Little," the man said, as Robin took his hand and was hauled upright like a child. "Robin of Loxley," said Robin, wringing water from his sleeve. And then, because he could not help it, he laughed. It was a full, free, unguarded laugh, the kind he had not managed in several weeks. John Little laughed too, and from that afternoon onward, the merry man would always call Little John, for the sheer pleasure of the contradiction, never left Robin's side. Not long after, the friar arrived. He was found, of all places, sitting on a log at the edge of a sun-warm clearing, eating an entire cold roast chicken with the focused contentment of a man who had made peace with all his priorities. He wore the rough brown robes of a wandering monk, though they were considerably better fed than most wandering monks Robin had encountered. He had a round, ruddy face, a fringe of gray hair above his ears, and the bright, watchful eyes of a man who was cleverer than he wished you to know. His name was Tuck. He explained cheerfully between bites, recently relieved a corrupt abbot of both his hospitality and his cellar, felt reasonably justified in doing so, and was currently seeking new employment in the general direction of righteousness. Robin offered him a place among them. Tuck finished the chicken, wiped his hands on his robe, and said he supposed that would do. He brought with him a remarkable knowledge of healing herbs, an inexhaustible capacity for good humor, and a singing voice that could make the oldest men in camp feel briefly young again on cold evenings. The others came in ones and twos after that, drawn by rumor and by need. Will Scarlet, quick-tempered and quicker with a blade, who had lost his family's land to a nobleman's greed and carried the memory of it like a coal behind his ribs. Much the miller's son, gentle and steady, who had given Robin shelter once without asking anything in return. A dozen more besides, farmers' sons, discharged soldiers, men the law had failed and the powerful had forgotten, each arriving at the camp beneath the 3 old oaks and finding, perhaps to their own surprise, that they did not want to leave. Robin never asked for loyalty. He offered shared bread and honest laughter and the quiet dignity of being seen. That was usually enough. And then there was Marian. She had come to Sherwood herself, alone, riding a gray horse through the autumn mist, as if she owned the forest and simply hadn't bothered to mention it until now. She was the ward of the sheriff's household, which made her position complicated, but she had spent years learning to move through complicated positions without stumbling. She was sharp and undeceived where Robin was warm and instinctive, and she understood the politics of Nottingham, its alliances and its cruelties, in ways he could not yet afford to ignore. He had known her before, in another life. They had been children together, years ago, running across the same summer fields. He recognized the way she tilted her head when she was deciding whether to trust something, and found he still found it rather wonderful. She did not stay in the camp full time, not at first. She moved between 2 worlds, the great hall and the greenwood, carrying information like water in cupped hands, careful not to spill a drop. She was, in her own way, as brave as any of them. Perhaps braver, because her courage was the patient, invisible kind that earns no songs. And so, as the leaves of Sherwood deepened from green to amber gold, A family assembled itself beneath the canopy. Not the family any of them had planned, not the lives they had imagined when they were young and the world still seemed to follow ordinary rules. But a family nonetheless, bound not by blood but by something that sometimes holds firmer than blood, shared purpose, and the willingness to sit beside one another through the cold hours, and to laugh when laughing was the bravest available option. The fires burned warm and low at night. Stories were told, songs were sung, and Friar Tuck sang them loudest. Little John whittled slowly at a piece of pale wood, saying nothing, which was his way of saying everything was well. Will Scarlet sharpened his blade and pretended he was not listening to the stories, though he was always the first to laugh. And Robin sat among them, watching the firelight move across their faces, and felt something settle in his chest like a stone finding the bottom of still water. Sherwood was no longer exile. It was home. And these people, his people, were ready, though none of them had said so yet, for what was coming next. What was coming next arrived, as such things often do, not with a trumpet's call, but with the quiet sound of suffering carried through the trees. It was Will Scarlet who heard it first, a woman's voice, thin and ragged, drifting through the undergrowth one gray morning before the mist had lifted from the forest floor. He followed it without thinking, the way one follows a thread of smoke to find a fire, and came upon her at the edge of the wood, where the old bridle path met the open road. She was kneeling in the mud beside an overturned cart, her shawl pulled tight, a child pressed against her side. The cart had shed its load across the path, a scatter of grain sacks split and leaking pale gold into the wet earth. Will did not need to ask what had happened. He could see the wheel tracks where the sheriff's riders had passed, could see the bruising along her wrist where the reins had been wrenched free. They had taken the horse. They had taken the better part of her grain. They had left her this, the mud, the broken cart, and a long road home. By the time Will brought her to the camp, Robin had already heard 3 other stories just like it that week. The villages to the south of Sherwood, Edwinstowe, Clipstone, the scattered hamlets along the river, had been leaning into a hard winter already when the sheriff's men had come through with their ledgers and their locked chests and their absolute indifference to what they left behind. The taxes were not new, but they had grown. Each passing season they had grown, the way a shadow grows as the sun moves lower, stretching longer and colder across the ground. A man who once paid a fair tithe now paid twice that, and if he could not, his tools were taken, his seed grain, the blanket from his children's bed. Robin listened to the woman. Her name was Agnes, and she had a son of 7 and a daughter of 4. And he did not speak for a long moment after she had finished. The fire between them breathed softly. Somewhere above the canopy a wood pigeon called and went quiet. Then he looked at Little John, who was already watching him with those calm gray eyes, and something passed between them that needed no words. The planning took 3 days. Robin was careful. He had always been careful, even when the fire in his chest urged him toward speed. He sent Much and 2 others out along the roads to learn the sheriff's collection routes, the timing of the tax carts, which roads they favored, and at what hour. He walked the forest paths himself, measuring distances, reading the land the way a river reads the shape of stone. Sherwood was his home now, and he knew it as only those who live quietly inside a place ever can. The hollow oak that could shelter 4 men standing. The ridge above the northern road, where the tree canopy thinned just enough to see the track below, the deep crossing of the stream where a loaded cart would slow to a crawl. And when at last he had it, the shape of what they would do, he gathered his people beneath the great canopy and laid it out for them simply, without flourish. They would not be bandits. That word, he told them, belonged to those who took for the sake of taking, who measured a man's worth by what could be stripped from him. That was not what this was. What this was, what this had to be, was a reckoning, a return. The sheriff's men were carrying wealth that had been pulled from the hands of the hungry, and they were going to put it back. Friar Tuck, who had been listening with his eyes half closed and his thick hands folded across his considerable middle, opened one eye and said that he believed this to be, on theological grounds, entirely sound. Little John simply cracked his knuckles and said he was ready. The first interception was so clean it was almost quiet. A tax cart rolling south along the Nottingham road, heavy laden, escorted by 4 of the sheriff's men who rode with the slack confidence of those who expect no trouble. They passed the hollow oak, they passed the ridge. They reached the stream crossing, where the horses slowed as the wheels dropped into the shallows. And then the forest seemed to breathe, and suddenly the road was no longer empty. Robin stepped out first, alone, an arrow already drawn and held with a loose and easy patience that somehow carried more weight than shouting ever could. The led rider reined in sharply. The others looked left and right, and found Little John on one side and Will Scarlet on the other, and beyond them, just visible between the trees, the still shapes of men they could not count. There was no violence. Robin had hoped there would not be, and there was not. The sheriff's men were hard, but they were not foolish, and 4 against a forest full of shadows is a mathematics that argues for caution. They were sent back the way they had come, lighter and with a message for their lord, not a threat, but a simple statement of fact, that while the people of the Shire went hungry, the roads of Sherwood would not be safe for cruelty. The cart Robin brought back himself. What happened in the village of Edwinstowe that evening was something Robin had not entirely anticipated, and it stayed with him for a long time afterward. He had expected gratitude, perhaps. He had expected relief. What he had not expected was how deep the relief ran, how it moved through those people, not like a wave, but like something unlocking, something long held and slowly released. An old man sat down in the road beside the cart and wept without sound, his hands pressed flat against the sacks of grain, as though to make sure they were real. A woman brought her children out to see, and her face had the expression of someone remembering a word they had almost forgotten. Robin stood back, because some moments are not for the one who carried the gift, but for the one who receives it. And he understood this. Marian, who had ridden out with them and stood now a little apart, watching, said quietly to him that she thought this was the most important thing she had ever seen. Not the taking from the sheriff, the giving back. He looked at her and understood exactly what she meant. The weeks that followed moved with a rhythm that became, in time, deeply familiar, a pattern of watchfulness and action, of long, quiet days in the forest and swift, precise hours on the roads. The merry men grew sharper with each passing interception, more practiced, more coordinated, reading each other's movements the way musicians learn to hear the space between notes. And the stories began to travel, as stories always do, carried by merchants and pilgrims and wandering friars, passed from village to village, like a flame passed from candle to candle, against the dark. The Sheriff of Nottingham heard these stories too, of course. He sat in his cold hall, in his great carved chair, and he heard what was being said about his roads and his tax carts, and this man in the forest, and the hearing of it was not pleasant for him. He was not a patient man, and he was not one to absorb a humiliation quietly. He had power, and he had coin, and he had men, and men with power and coin and soldiers do not tend to leave such matters unaddressed for long. The forest felt this shift, the way water feels the change in weather before the storm arrives. A new tension in the air, a new alertness in the camp. Robin sat by the fire one night, long after the others had found their sleep, and looked up through the canopy at the narrow scatter of stars above, cold and distant and very beautiful. Something was building. He could feel it the way you feel the turning of a season. Not yet here, but close, and coming steadily closer through the dark. And it came, as he had known it would, with the first frost of autumn. A rider passed through the villages that week, a royal herald by the look of his colors, and wherever he stopped, he unrolled a length of parchment and read aloud in a clear, carrying voice. There was to be a grand archery tournament, he announced, held in the open fields south of Nottingham, by gracious order of the sheriff himself. Any man in the shire was welcome to compete. The prize was a golden arrow, cast by the finest craftsman in the county, fletched with real goose feather and tipped with silver, a thing of extraordinary beauty, the herald assured his small, cautious audiences. A thing worth coming a great distance to win. The news reached Sherwood before nightfall. Little John heard it first, from a miller's boy who came breathlessly up the old deer path with wide eyes and muddy boots. He brought it straight to Robin, who was sitting against the broad base of an oak, mending a bowstring with the slow patience of a man who had learned not to waste thread. Robin listened without interrupting. When the boy had finished, he was quiet for a moment. "A golden arrow," he said. "Aye," said Little John, "and you can be sure it's not for the sport of it." Robin set down the bowstring, His eyes moved somewhere past the trees, toward the invisible south, toward Nottingham. He already knew what this was. The sheriff had grown tired of shadows. He had grown tired of the whispered name, the missing tax pouches, the grain that arrived at poor men's doors, as though placed there by some charitable ghost. He could not fight what he could not see. And so he had built a stage and sent out an invitation, knowing, as every man in the shire knew, that Robin of Loxley could no more resist a bow than the river could resist the valley. It was a trap, clean and simple, laid with the bait most carefully chosen, and Robin intended to walk straight into it. He told the others that evening, around the low fire, and was met with the precise mixture of alarm and admiration that he had come to expect from his merry men. Friar Tuck pressed his hands together and muttered something that may have been a prayer or may have been a mild curse. Little John crossed his enormous arms and stared at Robin with the expression of a man watching someone deliberately step onto thin ice. Maid Marian, who had ridden out from the town 3 days before with fresh news tucked inside her cloak, said nothing at all, which was more eloquent than anything she might have spoken. "I'll go in disguise," Robin said. "A traveling archer. No name, no livery. Just a long bow and a steady hand." "And if they recognize you?" Little John asked. "Then we'll leave in a hurry," Robin said, and smiled. And so it was that on the morning of the tournament, a lean man in a worn brown cloak joined the long road south toward Nottingham. He carried a plain bow of yew wood, unadorned and unremarkable. He had rubbed ash into his hair to dull its color. He kept his hood low, his steps unhurried, his face the quiet face of a man who had nothing particular to hide and nothing much to say. The tournament field was something to behold. Brightly colored banners snapped in the cool morning air. Red and gold, the sheriff's colors hung at every corner of the roped enclosure. Stalls sold roasted meat and honeyed bread. A band of musicians played somewhere out of sight, their notes wandering pleasantly above the crowd. And what a crowd it was! Hundreds of ordinary people from across the shire, drawn by the spectacle, by the rarity of a day that felt, however briefly, like celebration. The sheriff sat in an elevated box draped in velvet, surrounded by his guards and his advisers, his sharp eyes moving slowly and methodically across every face that entered the field. He was looking for someone. Everyone present understood this, even if they kept the understanding carefully to themselves. The archers were many, and most were skilled. The targets stood at distances that would have daunted a lesser marksman. First at 50 yards, then at 80, then at a full 100 paces, the straw circles, growing small and unforgiving in the autumn light. Men who had boasted all week of their accuracy found their arrows drifting wide. The crowd murmured sympathetically, and the field slowly narrowed. The man in the brown cloak said little and shot carefully. His first arrow split the center of the target at 50 yards. His second found it again at 80. Several nearby spectators glanced at him and glanced away. He was good, clearly, but so were others, and there was nothing about him to hold the eye. As the hours moved and the field thinned to its final few, the sheriff leaned forward in his velvet box. None of the remaining men were the face he was searching for, and yet he could not quite shake the sensation of something he could not name, a quiet attention at the edge of his vision, like a word on the tip of a tongue. The final round came down to 3 archers, a broad-shouldered soldier from the garrison, a young farmer's son who had surprised everyone by reaching the last stage, and the lean man in the brown cloak, who stood apart from the others and said nothing. The target now stood at 120 yards, a distance that made the straw circle look no larger than a closed fist from where the archers stood. The soldier shot first. His arrow flew true and struck the outer ring. A fine shot, and the crowd rewarded it warmly. The farmer's boy drew a long breath, loosed, and his arrow found the middle ring. A better shot still. The applause was genuine and generous. Then the man in the brown cloak stepped forward. Something happened in those moments that the people who were there would spend years trying to describe, and never quite managed to do fully. It was the stillness of him, perhaps. The way he seemed, in drawing back that yew bow, to become briefly part of the air itself, unhurried, untroubled, as though the 120 yards and the small circle of straw and the watching hundreds and the sheriff in his velvet box were all simply part of an ordinary afternoon. He loosed. The arrow crossed the field in silence. It struck the very center of the target with a sound that carried all the way back to the crowd. Not close to center, not near it, the absolute heart of it, clean and perfect. The field was briefly, completely still. Then the crowd erupted, and in that eruption, something shifted, because someone laughed in a particular way, or called out a word, or perhaps it was simply the quality of the shot itself, which was not the shot of a nameless traveling archer. The sheriff rose slowly from his chair. His guards moved, and the man in the brown cloak, without any visible haste, reached up and pressed the golden arrow, which had been placed in his hands before anyone thought to stop it, into his belt with a quiet satisfaction. He turned and walked, and the crowd, as crowds sometimes do when a story is unfolding that they understand instinctively, parted just enough and just in time. By the moment the guards reached the archer's mark, there was no one standing at it. The sheriff stood at the edge of his box and looked out across the emptying field, his jaw tight, the golden prize gone, his trap sprung and empty. Around him the banners went on snapping in the breeze, indifferent and bright. The musicians, unaware, played a cheerful reel that drifted out across the afternoon like a small private joke. Deep in Sherwood, before the light had fully left the sky, a familiar figure stepped between the trees. The golden arrow caught the last warmth of the day as he held it up, and the camp erupted, not loudly, but genuinely, with the warm and breathless laughter of people who had worried and hoped in equal measure, and could now let both go at once. Robin set the arrow against the great oak at the heart of the camp, where the firelight would find it each night. He stood back and looked at it for a moment. Not for the gold, not even for the winning, but because the sheriff had reached out his hand to take something from the people of the shire one more time, and the hand had come back empty. That night, the fire burned long and warm, and the stories told around it would not be forgotten for a very long time. And so the seasons turned, as seasons always do, and Sherwood Forest went on breathing in its slow, ancient way. The Sheriff of Nottingham did not vanish overnight. Men like him rarely do. But something had shifted in the shire the way a stone shifts in a riverbed after long rains. Imperceptibly at first, and then all at once. The people who had bent their heads in the market square began to lift them. A farmer who had been afraid to speak now spoke. A miller who had hidden grain in the floorboards began to sell it openly again at a fair price to neighbors who could afford it. Small acts, quiet acts, but they spread from village to village the way warmth spreads through a room when a door is finally closed against the cold. The sheriff raged, as powerful men do when they feel the ground softening beneath them. He sent riders out. He doubled the toll at the northern bridge. He stood in his high window and looked toward the tree line, that dark and unreadable wall of oak and ash, and he felt something he had not felt in years. He felt uncertain, and that uncertainty was everything. Deep in the forest, life continued with its gentle rhythms. Little John split wood each morning, the sound of it ringing out through the trees like a slow, unhurried bell. Friar Tuck tended a small kitchen garden he had scratched into a clearing, muttering cheerfully to his cabbages as if they were parishioners in need of encouragement. The merry men sharpened their arrows, mended their boots, laughed at one another's jokes, and slept soundly under canopies of leaves through which the stars came and went like distant, patient fires. Marian moved between the forest and the villages with the ease of water finding its level. She carried news, she carried medicine, she carried the kind of steady presence that people reach for when they are frightened. She had never needed a bow to change the shape of things. She knew that, and so did Robin. As the nights grew longer and the year began its slow lean toward winter, the fires at the camp burned a little earlier each evening. And around those fires, the stories began. Not new stories, old ones. Stories of what had already happened. The ambush at the river, the night they had filled a widow's storehouse before the first frost, the tournament and the golden arrow, and the look on the sheriff's face. Each time a story was told, it grew a little rounder, a little warmer, the way a river stone grows smooth from long handling. Details shifted. Moments stretched. The cold nights became colder in the telling, the victories a little sweeter, the laughter a little brighter. That is the nature of stories. They do not stay still. They live and breathe and find their shape in the telling. Robin would sit at the edge of the firelight on those evenings, listening more than he spoke. He had never thought of himself as a legend. He was, when all was said and done, a man who had been afraid and had acted anyway, a man who had been lonely and had been given companions he had never deserved and would never take for granted. He looked at the faces around him, the firelight moving across them, each one familiar and dear, and felt something he could not quite name. Not triumph, not pride, gratitude perhaps, quiet and full. The forest held them all. That is what he thought. The forest had always held them. Sherwood was old beyond remembering. It had been old when the first story of this land was whispered between people huddled in the cold. Its roots ran down into the dark earth and remembered everything that had ever happened beneath its branches, every act of courage, every moment of mercy, every child who had run laughing through a summer glade, and every fugitive who had pressed his back against an oak and listened to the silence and found that the silence held him too. The forest did not judge. It did not ask what you deserved. It only held you and waited, and in time it wove you into itself. And so it was with Robin. Not all at once, not with any great ceremony, but slowly, over years, the man and the myth began to merge, the way mist merges with the morning air, until you cannot say where one ends and the other begins. Long after the fires of that particular camp had gone cold, long after the names of the merry men had passed from living memory into the looser territory of legend, the story went on. Children heard it first, as children always do. Curled beside their mothers, half asleep, they listened to the voice that told them of a man who had lived in the green wood, who had taken from the cruel and given to the kind, who had laughed in the face of power and walked away whole. The children did not ask whether it was true. They knew, in the way that sleeping minds know things, that true was not the only kind of real. And the forest remembered. On still mornings when the mist lay low between the trees, and the light came slow and golden through the leaves, you might stand at the edge of Sherwood and feel it, something watching, something patient, something that had seen a great deal and forgotten very little. The whisper of the wind through oak leaves sounded almost like laughter sometimes, almost like the drawing of a bow. Perhaps it was nothing. Perhaps it was only the wind, or perhaps that is the very best place for a story to live, not in any book, not in any hall, but here in the long green light, in the unhurried sway of branches, in the soft and endless murmuring of leaves that have heard everything and will go on hearing long after we are gone. Rest now. The fire is warm, the forest is close, and somewhere in the deep wood, if you listen very gently, the old story is still telling itself, quietly, without hurry, to anyone who has the stillness to hear it.